Hello, I'm Dr. Maria Bellringer from the Gambling and Addictions Research Centre at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. And today I'm talking to you about one of our research projects we've recently finished, which was looking at the relationships between family violence and problematic gambling. So I'll be talking to you today about the results from our study, which will tell you how common family violence is amongst problem gamblers, and also give you some questions and thoughts about what the implications are finding. We all know that family violence is recognised as an issue of major social concern in most of the Western world. Now, family violence often is used to relate to intimate partner violence, which is violence between partners, current or ex-partners. But family violence is much wider than that. It includes violence towards children and other family members. The term family violence is also very broad because it can include physical violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse. That's something that's becoming more common, something that people are beginning to realise about. There can be abuse. It also includes things like harassment, stalking. Now, the background to our research project is in New Zealand, the gambling treatment providers were seeing high levels of family violence among their clients. And they wanted to make changes in terms of screening for family violence and providing support for family violence. But there was no hard evidence, no research to prove that family violence was associated with gambling. So they approached us at the Gambling and Addictions Research Centre and asked us if we would be able to together a research project. At that time, there were very few studies of family violence and harmful gambling, and most of the studies that had been done were on intimate partner violence and not on family. So at around that time, Australia, in fact here in Victoria, funded a study looking at family violence, and those researchers also conducted a sister study in Hong Kong. But there was nothing in New Zealand for them. As I say, up until that time, the research was limited, and the studies were mainly around characteristics of families experiencing harmful gambling and family violence, looking at family impacts of family. Our study was modelled on the Australian study. We did change something slightly, but it was modelled on work that was done. We recruited 370 gamblers and 84 affected others who were accessing the 3 national problem gambling treatments. All our participants, the clients, were 18 years or older, so they were all adults. And we only asked people if they would take part in the study if they presented to the services on their own. This was for the participant safety or the client safety, because if they were turning up at the services with someone else, we didn't want to take the chance that someone else may be a family violence user and for the client to be at risk. Now, when we invited them to take part in the study, we defined family violence as actual or threatened conduct by a person towards a member of the person's family, causing that person fear for his or her personal well-being and safety. And in our study, the focus was on physical abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and financial abuse. We conducted a short screen with these 370 gamblers and 84 affected others. The screen was embedded within the broader assessment that the treatment providers were asking of the clients in their first session. And the part for the research included a few questions around the problematic gambling to assess the severity of the gambling, and then a very short family violence screen to assess whether family violence may or be present. I'll be discussing that. After that short screening, we then asked, or the counsellors then asked all of these clients if they would be willing to take part in a much longer survey as part of the research, where they would be contacted by one of the university researchers and to answer more questions in depth about. At About half of these people said that they would be happy to take part. So we had 164 gamblers, 42 of them who took part in the second study. Now, I think it's important that I mention at this stage that before we even started the study and throughout the study, we consulted with 3 family violence groups who provided a lot of support and information to us to ensure that the participants' safety was a paramount consideration. So these family violence groups not only provided support and assistance to any of the clients, the participants who disclosed that they were victims or perpetrators of violence, but also they provided a lot of support to the counsellors in what to do if they had somebody who disclosed serious family violence or serious violence. And they helped us as researchers in terms of putting together a process for when we interviewed participants to keep the participants safe. For example, when we called them, if the abuser happened to be in the room, obviously we would not want to be doing. And they devised a whole security safety protocol for us so that we could make sure that our participants were safe throughout the study. Now, in terms of that bigger screen for the much longer interview, we collected quite a lot of information. We collected, obviously, socio-demographic data, age, gender, ethnicity, living arrangements. We also included a modified version of the HIT scale for family violence. This was actually also used in the screening process. I'll be talking about that in a moment. We collected information on gambling data, so gambling risk level, how severe the gambling was, motivation for the gamble, gambling participation, so that includes the frequency of gambling, expenditure spent on gambling. And we collected information on other treatment that may see for. We collected psychosocial data, so information on psychological distress, ability to regulate one's aggressive tendencies, emotion regulation, substance use, and interpersonal support. And finally, we collected data around behaviours and impact of the gambling, so coping behaviour, family impact. Now, the HIT scale, which is what we used to identify family violence, the HIT scale was actually developed back in 1993 by Sharon and colleagues. It was developed as a short domestic violence screening tool for use in family practice settings. It was only used to assess for someone who become a victim of family violence, and it was only used really to assess for intimate partners, not family violence per se. So the HIT scale has 4 questions and asks, in the last 12 months, as a current or ex-partner, just focused on this partner, as a current or ex-partner, physically hurt you, insulted or talked down, threatened you with harm, or screamed or cursed at you. Now, we modified this for our study. First of all, we wanted to be looking at family violence, not just intimate violence. So we modified in the last 12 months, current or ex-partner, or any family that has done these things to you. We also included an additional question on sexual abuse. We felt that this was something that was very important. So we included that 5th question. In the last 12 months, has the person forced you to have sexual activities? Now, the other modification is that the original HIT scale, the answers to each one of those questions there's multiple choice for answers. From never, meaning it happened before in the last 12 months, to just once, to very, very frequent or almost all the time. Now this, because our questionnaire was very long and also in the screening phase where we wanted to keep things brief, we didn't want to be thinking about all these responses. So we just modified ours to yes or no response. Yes, this happened. We also wanted to capture family violence perpetration, just being a victim. So we included the same questions again, but turning them around to, in the last 12 months, have you physically hurt a current or ex-partner? have you insulted or talked down, etc., or all of them? We collected all this data, and then obviously we had to analyze it. And I'm not going to go into detail with the data analysis, but the numbers, the quantitative data, we have a statistician who did fancy logistic variable modelling, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but not in great detail. And we also asked questions where people were able to expand on their answers and free talk, tell us what they wanted to. And for that data, the qualitative data, we just did a simple thematic analysis and put the results into themes so that we could see what was very common and what wasn't. So moving on to the demographics of our participants. In terms of their gender, what we see here is that the gambler participants, we have slightly more males than females. For the affected other participants, 3/4 of them were female and about 1/4 were male. Now, this demographic profile was very similar to the profile of people seeking treatment from the 3 National Treatment Services that did the study. Generally, for gamblers, it's almost a 50 split in terms of who turned up, slightly more males than females, but affected others, there were always substantially female who go to seek treatment because of something. So our participants were very similar to people who were, on the whole, setting up treatment. We also collected age information. As you can see, that the majority of our participants were aged between 25 and 64 years. We had a few who were in the younger age bracket and a few who were in the age bracket. It was fairly similar in the 25 to 44 age year group, but in the 45 to 64 year age group, we had a greater proportion of females, about half, but only about 1/3 of the males were in that age group. Ethnicity is where our participants in the research project differed from the general profile of people seeking officer. We categorized ethnicity in terms of Maori or indigenous population, Pacific people who are now living, Asian people and European people, stroke other, who is everybody else. Now, in terms of the profile of our participants, we recruited substantially more Asian participants than were turning up at the treatment service. So for some reason, Asian people were quite interested in taking part, and that's where our participant demographics differed slightly from the demographics of people who were treated. We also thought it was very important to capture people's living arrangements, seeing as this project is related to violence and gambling. As you can see from this chart, the majority or the larger proportion of our participants were in a relationship, a living arrangement, where they were living as a couple and they had children, dependent children. I just, for brevity, call couple kids. Yeah. So about 1/3 of our gambler participants and just over half of our affected other participants were living in that couple relationship with children. We had about 19% of the gamblers and 16% of the couple relationship without children. And then the others had different living arrangements, a shared house where people might be flat with friends with. We had some single parents, some people were single, and a few who lived in other types of businesses, unspecified. Now to what's probably a little bit more interesting for you. On the left of this chart, we have overall family violence. So this is where participants answered yes to at least one of those 5 questions, being a victim. So we can see that just under half of the gamblers and 2/3 of the affected others said that yes, they have been a victim. We then asked them explicitly about each of the questions, and what we can see here, what stands out here, is that the most common forms of violence are the verbal violence, insulted or talked down, screamed or cursed. So we have just over a third of gamblers, and then about half to just over half of affected others who said that they had been a victim of one of these forms of verbal violence, verbal abuse. We did have people who said that they had been physically abused, threatened with harm, and some who were. When we look at the profile of perpetration of family abuse, we see a similar profile. So overall, about 2/5 of the gamblers, so half of the affected others, said that they had perpetrated that. And again, the verbal forms of abuse were the most common. A third of gamblers, just under half of affected others, said that they had assaulted or talked down. And similar percentages that screened for them. Again, we had some that they had perpetrated physical violence, threatened. Interestingly, nobody admitted perpetrating it. Now, I probably need to mention at this stage that the gamblers and affected others were not necessarily related to each other. We just asked clients who were turning up at treatment services if they would like to take. So they may have been related to each other. Affected others tended to, or more affected others tended to report perpetrating forms of violence. In terms of the financial abuse questions, these were a separate set of questions that was detailed in the chart along the bottom. So we asked questions around whether people were concerned about their money going in, whether they had ever had money taken, or whether money had been taken from their bank account without their permission, whether they'd been forced to sign papers about that they didn't control of money, that they didn't want to sign, and whether they'd been forced to gamble in order to try and win money. So a different type of form of financial abuse specific to property. As you can see from this chart, what's immediately apparent is that affected others, more affected others, reported all these forms of abuse at a much higher level than gamblers. So, for example, being concerned about money going missing, only 11% of gamblers are concerned about money going, but almost half of the affected others. Only 3% of gamblers said that they had had money taken from their purse or wallet without their permission. But almost a third of affected others said that, and similarly with money being taken from the bank without permission. We had a few people who said that they'd been forced to sign papers about that, and nearly 5% of affected others said that they had been forced to gamble to get money, versus only 1% gamblers saying that. When we look at perpetration of financial abuse, the profile you can immediately see very, very different. In that gamblers were generally much more likely to admit to perpetrating these different forms of financial abuse. So nearly 20%, nearly a fifth of gamblers said that they had taken money from someone's personal wallet without, versus only 2% of affected others doing it. 13% of gamblers said that they had taken money from a bank account without permission. No affected others. Interestingly, in terms of forcing families to sign papers, 8% of affected others said that they had done this, perpetrated this, versus only 2% of gamblers. And I think this is probably relating to the fact that affected others were trying to take control of the family finances, gambling. Interestingly, we see that just under 1%, 0.6% of gamblers said that they had forced someone to gamble for them and win money, but no effect. Now, we felt it was important to find out who this family violence was being perpetrated against, who the victims were. And I mentioned earlier that most of the previous research had been done on intimate partners only. And what we find is that actually 3/4 of family violence, 3/4 of the victims, 3/4 of the perpetrators were actually intimate partners, current or ex. About 10% reported that the violence was to or from a son or daughter, so a child. Unfortunately, we didn't measure or didn't ask the question as to whether these were adult children or children. So it's not possible for us to say, but I would imagine that there are adult and perhaps some children. And then about a third of gamblers and about a quarter of affected others, the other family members were involved. And this didn't just necessarily mean nuclear family members, parents, etc. It could include much wider family members. It included things like grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, second cousins, in-laws. It could include a whole raft of family members, and our participants did actually mention a whole list of family members, those who said there were all sorts of family. Now we asked participants to tell us about the impact that gambling on the people. So from the gambler's perspective, the impact of their gambling on their family. From the affected other's perspective, it was the impact on the gamblers gambling on themselves and their family. Now this chart is slightly different from the other charts in that it's not showing percentage of people who reported this, but what we asked was for the participants to rate on a scale of 0 to 50, where 0 were no impact and 50 was the maximum level of severe impact, to rate where they thought their impacts were. And this chart shows the average of all the gamblers and all the affected others. So what we can see immediately is gamblers are probably underestimating the level of impact of gambling on the members, because the average score was 34 versus the score of 43 for affected others. Now you might be wondering why, what this has to do with family violence, and you'll see. So we then asked the participants to explain to us what these impacts were on the gambling. Financial deprivation was the most common. So a quarter of gamblers and 2/3 of affected said that there had been because of gambling. This is to be expected. The other negative forms of impact of effect were emotional upset, relationship, loss of trust, absence of the gambler, relationship breakup, negative health effects. There were also a few people, a small percentage, who said positive effects of gambling, and interestingly, almost a quarter of the gamblers said that there were no effects of the gambling. You'll notice that no affected others. Now, of all these findings, I think that one of the more important ones is relationship problems, where we had about a quarter of the gamblers and almost 2/5 of the affected others who said that there had been relationships. We asked them to explain in more detail what these relationships were, and it turned out that they related to violence. So, for example, I've got a few quotes here. My partner was angry. We lost our trust. We were fighting continuously. Violence. It has caused arguments, made me feel ill, and lose control. When confronted by my family, I become defensive and aggressive. I can have a violent mood. When he loses money, he comes and shouts and yells at the kid. This is verbal abuse to dependent children. This is all very interesting. Family violence and gambling is an effect. But is it actually a causal effect? Is the gambling causing the family? Or is it something else? We wanted to know the answer for this. We asked this question. And what we see is that it's fairly similar in terms of the proportion of gamblers affected, others, perpetrators and victims. We think that there is a relationship. Similarly, it was fairly similar between those who thought that it could go either way. Sometimes the family violence leads to gambling. All the participants reported that the violence occurred because we see a bit of difference here between affected others and gambling. The affected other participants, just less than half of the victims, just more than half of the perpetrators. Others said that the violence was in response to gambling. Only 20% of gambler victims and a third of gambler perpetrators. Less people said that gambling occurred in response to violence, but there were few. So again, we probed in more detail to find out about it. What we've got here in the two columns is comments from victims and comments from perpetrators. So in response to, for those victims who said that the violence was because of some crime, my wife screamed and cursed at me verbally when I did not bring money to her. Yeah, well. He takes it out on me when he is having a bad day. Yeah. On the perpetrator side, I was angry because I was not able to understand his gambling. Maybe that's why I screamed and threatened him. Gambling in response to the violence. Gambling is occurring because of the violence. A victim's comment. My sisters expected me to fail. They set me up to fail, and I did. We didn't have any of our participants give us further information on what they meant. So in terms of gambling and violence going either way, victim comment. Sometimes I initiate an argument. Sometimes she does. My husband has become aggressive when he lost me. He went back to gamble when he was angry. And similarly, in terms of perpetrator comments, they had similar things about mutual frustration, mistrust. For those participants who said that there is no relationship between family violence and gambling, an example of the comments was, my wife has been verbally abusive. That violence. And similarly, perpetrators said the same thing, that it was related to particular family relationship issues. So an overall summary of our findings, and the numbers detailed here, the percentages are slightly different from what you've seen earlier because this is looking at gamblers and affected others altogether. About a half of people in our study said that they've been victims of family violence, some form, 44% they have perpetrated. And most of the violence is verbal, screaming or cursing, assaulting, but physical violence, threatening physical harm. Sorry, as well. Now we tried to look at some risk factors for being a victim of violence and perpetrating family violence, and where our statisticians that on variable modelling, where it's quite complicated, but they took into account all the known factors that go with family violence. So excessive alcohol use, drug abuse, those things are known to increase family violence. So they did special statistical model, put all this information in and discounted findings that were related to them. And what was left in terms of statistical analysis is the actual risk of family violence related to gambling. And what we found is that risk for being gamblers being victims of family violence, having children at home, and if they were experiencing and risk factors for perpetrating family violence was having family members with mental health issues. That's a really important finding, that having dependent children at home leads to increased risk for family violence. And what we found was that it was more than twice the risk of perpetrating, and over 3 times the risk of being a victim of family violence who have been. So to summarise the findings that I've talked about today, family violence is common amongst help-seeking gamblers, seeking effective who have gone to treat gambling. So, but most of the violence is local and to partner, although family violence to other family members. Gamblers appear to underestimate the harm, negative effects on their families. And, very important, having dependent children increase the risk of being a victim of family violence. And this has not previously been researched in problem. Why is this increasing? I don't have the answer to that. It's something that you might like. But could it be because there's increased financial pressure for raising a child in a family that's already under pressure? Again, we all know it's expensive to raise children. Families with problem gamblers, money is being led out. It's not there for the family or the children. Is this one of the reasons why there's a big risk of family violence? Maybe it's to do with loss of traditional roles. For example, if the mother is the one who is expected to do more of the family-related things, looking after the child, but that mother is out gambling, so she's not at home doing the duties, and the father has to take over, does this lead to exploitation? Again, I don't know the answer. I'm posing these questions because this hasn't been investigated, and it's probably something that more research or to investigate why these people are more at risk. And this risk is over and above the risk that is generally known in terms of violent families, that there is more risk if there are dependent children. This is over and above that, being in a problem family and having the risk. So, importantly, what are the implications of these findings? Well, I think one of the important findings is that the short screen that we use, the modified version of the scale, is simple and practical and easy to use by people who are not family violence experts. In the screening phase of our study, the clients were turning up at services, being told about the screens using this modified scale. The counsellors did that, and they embedded it within the general assessments that they were doing with counselling. It was quick to use. It didn't add or didn't take up a lot more time than they would normally take it. And they found it was very useful. So it could be used together with existing procedures to identify family violence amongst individuals as an initial screen, which would then lead to further discussion with the client. But I think it's really important. Appropriate training is required on how to report and assess the risk value, and to ensure that support safety processes are in place for people to disclose one and of serious risks to themselves. So, for example, we didn't invite anyone to end up at services with someone else in case that someone was perpetrator, victim of family violence. That would have caused expectation of more violent risk to those people. So how would that be approached with treatment? It's something to think about. And also, the safety mechanisms and processes need to be in place to not only make sure that the counsellors are safe, comfortable in terms of asking about family violence, again, in treatment, but also to make sure that the appropriate support processes can be in place for people to disclose. And it's also important that in regard to training, because, for example, this simple screen just has a yes and no. So I might answer and say to you, yes, in the last 12 months, I've screamed and shouted at my husband. I've probably done that myself. But it doesn't mean I'm a violent. I'm not a family violence perpetrator. My husband certainly would be a violent. It was just a one-off argument where I shouted at him to get my point. So that's perhaps not really important, and perhaps it's not actually family violence, but just one occasion of saying that he was sexually abusive. But I think that does count as violence. That's one type of really. So it's important to put this in perspective. This is a screening tool to provide initial information on whether this needs to be explored. I think it's also important that family violence services should be encouraged to screen for propaganda, especially if dependent children are present. Now that we've found that increased risk of violence, being a victim, particularly also perpetrated family violence, there are dependent children. So I think that's something else that is quite important. And we also need to remember that there will be other factors in play. It's not just family violence and propaganda that go together, but we all know that, of course, alcohol and drug issues lead to family violence, but mental health problems in family members came out of the risk factor. It's important that this is also taken into account. Its screening tool opens the way, paves the way for further exploration. Now, I do need to say to you, all this data that I've given you, that you've seen in the slides, take it with don't take the figures as 100%. These are the figures. We had a self-selected convenient sample of gamblers and other two. We didn't screen everybody. However, as I said, the profile of our participants was very similar to the profile of our and other people, except for we recruited more Asian participants into our study than the percentage of Asian generally active. We also didn't assess the frequency of violence, but I've already discussed is something that's quite important. We just took family violence because someone said yes, that this had happened in the past 12 months, and it didn't make sense. So that's another important consideration. And finally, we had small sample sizes or small numbers of participants, particularly in the second phase of our study, the much bigger survey, where we only had 42 affected others who took part. Now, the smaller the numbers who take part in research, the bigger the margin of error. So I've given you percentages of what we found. Those will not be precise percentages. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at the data that I'm showing you. So this is my last slide. I would like to acknowledge that the New Zealand Ministry of Health funded this whole study. And also we couldn't have done the study without the willing participation of the 3 national treatment providers and all their clients who were very happy and willing to share 2 very stigmatized subjects, that often gambling and family violence. I think these slides, well, you've got these slides, I think they can be made available to you, but I'm always happy to answer any questions if you'd like to know me. Have my email address. And if you're really interested, we have our full research report on our website, aut.ac.nz/GARC. If you go to the research reports page, you will find the report there. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you found it.